Okay, and welcome to week 2. And in this week, we're going to be looking at chapters 4 and 5. Just a quick note, 4 and 5 are going to be on your first test. So they'll be part of the unit. You have a review sheet that's going to be available to you. I told you about it last week, but you might want to use that and fill it out. Talk more about that when we talk about the structure of the course. I'll refer to you that in the video that I'm going to post in the syllabus. Okay, so let's take a look at chapter 4, which is the Constitution. Now, this, of course, would be an entirely separate course, and depending what you want to focus on, but this class focuses on business law. So in this one chapter, we're going to look at the Constitution, but we're going to kind of look at it through a filter of how it impacts business. Having said that, we do have to give you some background in the creation of the Constitution, its interpretation, a little bit then the application of business and the Bill of Rights. So we'll start off the first part of this with the purpose of the Constitution. We're talking about the Constitution of 1787. And then we'll move on to the broad structure of the Constitution. We'll look at Articles 1, 2, and 3 primarily, and then we'll transition into looking at the Bill of Rights. Finally, we'll look at some of the historical basis of the Constitution as it developed, both ideas of precedent being established, case law being established, sometimes even being overturned or sometimes being made. We will focus in particular, as one of the central ideas of this chapter, on how one interprets the Constitution, and there are going to be two major schools that we'll talk about: the strict constructionalist or textualism school, sometimes rather erroneously called the conservative school, which looks at the literal words as they were written and as they were understood at the time. The primarily alternative is going to be the living constitutional interpretation, or living constitution, again inaccurately referred to here mainly as a liberal interpretation. We also will look at some of the individuals that have shaped the court, some of the ones that are on the court today, 9 judges and justices that are on the court, and including some of the new ones on the Roberts Court. We then will transition more to looking at the economy and business in the Constitution. In particular, we'll look at specific clauses or parts of the Constitution: the full faith and credit clause, which is very important for the enforcement of contracts; the Commerce Clause, which is very important about the authority of Congress to regulate the economy; the Supremacy Clause, which is pretty important in regards to how the Constitution supersedes state law. And then we will conclude this little section with privileges and immunities, how different states have leeway, the idea of the states as a laboratory, still within the constitutional framework, to treat people differently across state boundaries. We'll conclude this looking at individual freedoms, some of which impact business, some of which are just important as a note to look at. Things like critical amendments. These can be due process in particular. We'll look at substantive and procedural due process. We'll look at critical cases, and very often we'll use those cases to highlight how the Constitution is interpreted and give real meat or substance to living constitutionalists versus textualists. We'll also look at some future trends. When we get to business ethics, this is a little bit shorter chapter. It's still a very important one. We will focus on ethics and morality. Then we'll look at the two major alternative systems that are discussed ethically in your text: utilitarianism and basically duty-based or Kantian economics. Kantian philosophy. So we're going to define ethics as the kind of practical application of morality. Then we're going to look at how ethics is applied in business and whether it is or is not important. We even will, and we might look at this on the discussion board, talk about how seemingly there is a conflict between short-term ethical behavior and long-term ethical behavior. We then will move on and look at, using primarily Jeremy Bentham as our model, the definition of utilitarianism, which, the quickie one is the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number, although it's more complex than that. We'll certainly discuss that in class. We'll talk about how there are some traps or some problems with utilitarianism that some view as essentially fatal to its application. We'll look at Kant, named after the philosopher Immanuel Kant, a German. We'll look at his creation of the idea of categorical imperative, which is a very useful tool to develop ethical rules of behavior and its application in business. We'll move on to the next chapter, which is going to be about torts. Now, this will not be on the exam, but basically we will define torts. We'll talk about different types. We'll look at damages. We'll look at torts and crime. Look at negligence and defense. Torts, of course, are quickly a civil wrong. We'll look at how they arise, their cause of actions, the three main categories of tort: intentional, the most important one, negligence, and then business. We definitely will look at the dozens and dozens of types of torts, and a lot of these will have analogies in the criminal side as well. And the negligent torts, which are probably for business the most important, are generally not viewed as criminal. We'll look at damages, in which this will introduce us to the topic of tort reform, whether damages should be